Hello, viewers. My name is Graham Sasso, and I am a local Victoria philosopher from Victoria, British Columbia. And I'm joined here today with my friend Ryan, a fellow philosopher, also from Vancouver Island, from the Courtenay area. And today we're going to be discussing on our inaugural episode of the Philosophy Salon, a question that is most fundamental to understanding the nature of philosophy, which is simply, what is philosophy? So I'd like to welcome you, Ryan, to this open-ended conversation we'll be having, and welcome you to the inaugural episode. So let's just briefly toast to that.
Thank you for having me.
It's no problem. It's a pleasure as always. And I'm just looking forward to getting into this question of what is philosophy that we've been pondering about for seems like ages now. So without further ado, let's dive in. So I guess the first question to ask simply is just, what is philosophy? And I think a natural starting point is to look at the historical origins of the word and where the word originates. And so the question to ask is, what are some of the primordial definitions, that go back to the very beginnings of philosophy in our in ancient Greece, in our ancient history that we've inherited. And the question to ask is, what's the primordial definition of philosophy as it was presented in the story told by Heraclides, and whether that captures its true meaning. So, I mentioned in the lecture portion that complements our salon that Heraclides tells the story of how Pythagoras encountered this character named Leon at the Pan-Hellenic Games, and it was in this particular conversation that it was revealed to Leon what exactly the meaning of philosopher was, because to him it was an entirely novel term, and he was somewhat astonished by what Pythagoras meant by this word. So let's kind of meditate on this a little bit and see if we can get to some clarity as to what was meant by philosophy in this sense. I thought it would be useful maybe just to briefly go over the passage that describes the nature of philosophy from not from Heraclides himself, because we don't have any of his surviving writings, but we know of the story of Heraclides and of how the word originated at the Pan-Hellenic Games between Leon and Pythagoras through Cicero, as well as Diogenes Laertius. But I'm just going to briefly quote Cicero's passage, because I think it's maybe a little more historically accurate, maybe more clearly stated. So the passage kind of goes along like this. There are some few who, taking no account of anything else, earnestly look into the nature of things. And these men call themselves studious of wisdom, that is, philosophers. And as it is the most reputable occupation of all to be a looker on without making any acquisition. So in life, the contemplating things and acquainting oneself with them greatly exceeds every other pursuit in life. So I think the key thing to highlight here is the part of the sentence that men call themselves studious of wisdom, that is, philosophers, and that they earnestly look at the nature of things. I think these are the most important words to highlight here, because they kind of get at the meaning of the sense of philosophy, at least as how it's being used in this passage here. So just to offer some brief elucidation of what's going on here. In the original sense, it seems that the term philosophy referred to looking into the nature of things and acquainting oneself with the knowledge of the nature of things. So to be a philosopher is to be a looker on, someone who seeks to acquire knowledge as the fundamental pursuit of life. Now, from this suggestion, I think that the sense of philosophy which this passage is suggesting is that philosophy is more theoretical in nature, that it's more defined by what the Greeks would call Sophia, rather than practical wisdom, which what they would call phronesis. And so I guess one preliminary question to ask is, would we agree to this? And would we agree that the fundamental pursuit of life as a philosopher is to acquire knowledge? And if we're to agree to that point, would this put a lopsided emphasis on the acquisition of knowledge over other pursuits that we might consider being fundamental for a philosopher? So I'd be interested to kind of get your own impressions on these issues. And so we can just dive in there. If you want to maybe even just say a few things about you before we actually get going, a brief introduction, and we can get rolling with it.
Yeah, I mean, not much to say about me. I mean, I went to the University of Victoria for the majority of my philosophy education. So most of my education was done down there, but I'm currently residing in Courtenay. And yeah, I think we've been tackling this issue for a while. So I'm really excited to get into this and to kind of dig our teeth into it. So in terms of philosophy being more about Sophia than phronesis, I think I would agree with it more or less, in the sense that I think the activity definitely is about Sophia, but maybe the goal is something of a phronesis. Like we want to theorize about things, and the way things are, but I think ultimately what our goal is here as philosophers is to be able to apply that to practical matters in the world and to maybe develop some sort of phronesis. At least that's the way I see philosophy now. Maybe from a historical point of view, that's maybe less of the case. But I think maybe that's just sort of what the demands are in our culture, which is for things to have some sort of practical application. So I think, at least as it stands now, for me, I think Sophia's perhaps the way to get to phronesis in a way, to be able to reason about practical matters, and to accomplish things in a more efficient way, in a way that takes into consideration, prudence, various other virtues. So I'm not sure that I agree entirely, but it definitely is, Sophia definitely is sort of, I'd say, like the practice or the starting point for philosophy.
Right. I think that's fairly well put. And I think I would largely agree with your assessment in that regard. I think that in trying to understand the meaning of philosophy, the word philosophy, the pursuit of philosophy, whatever that is at this provisional stage of our discussion, I think that the virtues of this definition, as it's implied in this passage, told in this story by Heraclides, is that philosophy does involve theorizing to an extent, right? It is a theoretical pursuit to an extent. I think that what this passage captures is that it's a particular activity of the philosopher, that the philosopher engages in theorizing. The philosopher wants to know how everything came to be, how the cosmos unfolded, how it got all started. Was there a start, or is the cosmos infinite? These are questions that a philosopher will ask. And I think they cover one aspect of the coin, which is the theoretical side of the coin. And so I think this passage does a nice job on touching on the nature of theoretical wisdom, and that, yes, philosophy is a theoretical pursuit. We want to come up with a theory of the nature of things. We want to use the visual metaphor that this term is based upon. We want to gaze at reality. We want to look upon reality. Um, just as an interesting aside, and we've talked about this before, that philosophy in this context was originally meant to be a spectator gazing on upon a crowd. In fact, the context in which Pythagoras and Leon met was at the Pan-Hellenic Games, and they were actually gazing upon all of the events occurring at the Games. So the Pan-Hellenic Games were kind of like the ancient Olympics, right? And there were other festivities and things also at these gatherings. So I think it's somewhat a befitting metaphor for philosophy more generally. We, just as we gaze at Olympic sprinters running the 100 meters, we also gaze upon the universe at large. We gaze upon the stars, and we gaze upon the heavenly bodies, and then we theorize about how all of that came to be. And so I think this definition, if we want to consider this a definition of philosophy, I think it covers that one side of the coin, that theoretical side. But I think what it overlooks is the rest of the nuances within the definition of philosophy. And in particular, I think to fundamentally understand the meaning of philosophy, we need to more fully understand its etymology and its word root, right? So, of course, the word root of philosophy is love of wisdom. So maybe a natural place to segue from here is, what is the love of wisdom? And maybe we can unpack that proposition and look at all of its different components. So first of all, let me ask a question: what is love? Because that's one component. And more specifically, what is love in the philosophical sense of the word? And do we? There are different definitions of love according to the philosophers and according to the Greeks. And so maybe we can briefly touch upon those and then see which of those might be most relevant, the understanding of philosophy in our sense of the word. So the ancient Greeks talked about, for example, basically three kinds of love, at least three kinds of love. So there was eros, and eros was sort of well, first of all, the term eros itself comes from Greek mythology, comes from Hesiod, and eros was the god of love in Hesiod's mythological universe. And then as the meanings of words evolved, eros took on the connotation of sexual love. And we see that in the writings of Plato, for instance, in his Symposium in particular. And he talks about how sexual love, in some sense, can transform itself into a love of the ideal form of love. So to put this differently, for Plato, we start off, say, with sexual love, say sexual love toward a beautiful woman or a beautiful person, or so on and so forth. And then that love, part of that love participates in the love of the ideal. So the ideal here is beauty. So the beautiful person participates in the ideal beauty. And so by maybe loving a particular person, we can then develop a greater appreciation for, the love of the form of the beautiful. And so that might be relevant to our definition of philosophy. There's also philia, which is another Greek term for love, and it has a somewhat different meaning. And the meaning of philia is more akin to the love we have of a friend, the love we have for a loved one. It's also the attitude that we bear to our beloved. And the attitude, roughly, in Aristotelian terms at least, We love someone or something because it's useful, because it's pleasurable, or because we admire that thing. And so in that sense, I think that also applies to our definition of philosophy, because we love wisdom because we find it useful, because we find it pleasurable, because we find that the pursuit of wisdom is in some sense admirable in an ethical sense. And in a particular sense, we generally love people who embody philosophy. So, in the particular, we love particular philosophers. We love Socrates because he was wise. We love Socrates. So in that sense, we love Socrates because he was admirable, because he was virtuous. We also love Socrates for what he said. What he said was very useful. The knowledge that he imparts, allows us to develop a knowledge of how we should, better live our lives. And Socrates was also, a pleasing guy to be around. Apparently, he was kind of the life of the party. Apparently, he could drink everybody under the table, and so he was an interesting guy to have a conversation with. And so, in that sense of the word, I think we could make sense of love of wisdom from that standpoint as well. So, so that's one way of thinking about it. And then lastly, there's agape, and agape is also a Greek term, and agape basically just means unconditional love. So it's the love that a parent has for their kid, for example. So that's love. That's the love side of it.
I definitely think I just want to elaborate maybe a bit more on the philia form of love. I think a way of viewing philia is, philia. I think when I think of philia, I think of sort of the love that a child has for his grandfather. His grandfather, the grandfather kind of embodies sort of wisdom in the family. They're the one that you sort of have a bit of reverence, sort of the most respect for in the family, especially as a young man. It's someone that you look up to, and someone that you almost listen to without question. You listen. Wisdom. The wisdom of the grandfather is sort of the pinnacle of family knowledge, and I think that's a good way of viewing philia, is that sort of love. It's not a romantic love. Maybe it's a bit of sort of this unconditional agape, sort of the love that a parent would have for a child. But I think really philia captures that relationship between us and our appreciation for wisdom.
Right. Yeah, I would agree, definitely. I think it's a nuanced definition, but I think there are different types of love manifest themselves in the love of wisdom. And like you just said, philia is one of those. And, I almost feel like that it makes more sense to love wisdom in the concrete, in the specific. So, we love, like I said, we love Socrates because he teaches us about the nature of good and about what it means to be a virtuous person. And we find him pleasurable because we enjoy his company over wine at the symposium. And, we find him to be admirable because of his virtuous qualities, because he's courageous, because he's wise, because he's temperate, because he's prudent. And so I almost feel like we can love philosophy as it embodies itself in particular people, in particular personalities. I also think we can maybe even love philosophy in that sense in the abstract. We can love theoretical and practical ideas, for instance, for their utility, for their pleasure, for the virtues that they impart. And indeed, as we've discussed before, human beings have a tendency to personify ideas, to personify the abstract, to make sense of them. And so, we often, for example, justice, the virtue of justice, we often will personify as Lady Justice, with the scales. And people, like you mentioned, people who are lawyers or people who are, care about justice, they love justice and law just as if it was a person. It's an ideal that they have a deep affection for. And even if you look back to at ancient Greece, the Greeks personified reason itself, as Apollo, and they personified theoretical wisdom as Athena. And so it would seem in that sense, that we could maybe even love philosophy in the abstract. We can love the virtues that are characteristic of theoretical wisdom. We can love the virtues that are characteristic of practical wisdom. The two wisdoms that make up what it is for something to be an instance of wisdom, which we'll get into.
People even talk about, defending justice as if justice were a person or an entity to be defended. There is that personification, like you're saying, which I find interesting philosophically and psychologically. Why that takes place. I think that's an interesting point to note.
Right. Yeah, I think it underlies maybe a more basic human tendency to personify the world, and let's go on a little bit of a digression here, maybe, because we have lots of time on our hands. We're philosophers, right? So, in ancient times, what we see in the evolution of human thought is that, at least based on our surviving written fragments and so on from, say, Hesiod and Homer, that humans had this tendency to personify nature. In Hesiod's universe, we had, the various gods that were personified, like chaos was a particular god, eros was a particular god, Gaia was a particular god, and all of these gods, we attribute human characteristics and qualities to, Eros being the god of love. So when we feel and experience love, it's as if there is this God that we kind of that interacts with us, perhaps to some extent. When we feel love, that God's energies are entering into us as if we were sort of a conduit to the divine, to the gods, right? Or when we get a flash of insight, it's because Apollo has worked through us in that sense. So it seems to speak to a human tendency, to personify nature, and then, and so because we have that tendency, we, it makes sense that we can love ideals and things in the abstract, and maybe that's a valid way of expressing our love of wisdom. That's something that we can maybe discuss about as well. Whether the tendency to personify nature, whether that is, in some sense, is that reflect a primitive way of thinking, or is it a sophisticated way of thinking? We can maybe discuss and debate that. We can return to that thread. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think maybe it's, psychologically, like, it's easier to love something that is abstract by sort of conceiving it as something concrete and particular, as a person, as some sort of entity. And I think we do that a lot, even, um, when we talk about nationalism or something like that. There's sort of like a personification or a way that we make an abstract concept like justice or a nation like Canada or the United States. Um, we even refer to, a lot of times refer to countries as, oh, I'm going to defend her. This is the motherland or the fatherland or something like that. So I think, psychologically, it's a lot easier for people to attach themselves to these abstract concepts when we make them particulars in this way. So I'm not sure it's maybe a primitive way of thinking. I think we still do this in a lot of ways. I'm not sure it's gone away any less. I think maybe it's maybe even intensified in a certain way that we haven't even noticed. I don't want to get into the politics too much, but I think there's certain areas where people do this. They make very abstract concepts into particulars, and they really attach themselves to these, and they identify with them. It's sort of it's like how the Greeks they personified nature. Um, we're doing the same thing in sort of the political sphere a lot of times. So we don't really do it with nature anymore because we have a scientific understanding. But I think these areas that still escape our scientific understandings, that are still hard and difficult for us to make predictions about, we tend to personify them until we come up with a way of explaining them and making predictions about them in a sort of rigorous scientific manner.
Yeah, no, I hardly agree with all of that. I think we often think about things more concretely and more imagistically before we think about them more abstractly and more theoretically, whether that's being a physicist or a chemist or even a philosopher thinking about things more in the abstract. So yeah, in any case, yeah, that's all good, good food for thought. So bearing all of that in mind, we've kind of come to some provisional understanding of what love is, at least in the philosophical sense. So maybe we can tackle the other side of the coin here, which is what is wisdom? And there's lots to be said about that. So we might ask the question, because philosophy or wisdom as it's defined typically in the ancient texts at least, and this at least goes back to Aristotle, is that wisdom is of two sorts. There's theoretical wisdom, which the Greeks translates in ancient Greek as Sophia. And then there's practical wisdom, which in ancient Greek translates as phronesis. And theoretical wisdom is the kind of wisdom that we use when we engage in more abstract thinking, that we use when we engage, for example, in logical thinking. When we logical inference, for instance, when we infer, you think of the rules of logic. If A, then B. So if A is the case, then B is the case. So if all human beings are mortal, Socrates is mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, right? And so that's one instance.
I think we miss a step. So yeah, if all human beings are mortal, and Socrates is a human being, then Socrates is mortal. I think we said mortal twice there.
Right.
Yeah, just to clip. Yeah,
I skipped a step there.
yeah.
Yes. Thanks for the correction there.
But I think everyone probably knows what you mean by that.
Yeah. Socrates is a human being. No, all human beings are mortal.
Yeah.
Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Correct. Yeah.
So symbolically, we translate that as if A, then B, A, then B, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's just logical inference. We also engage in theoretical wisdom when we try to understand cause and effect. So we're trying to understand, if we're a cosmologist, we're trying to understand how the universe began. Well, we might theorize about what were the causes of the universe, and what was the effect of those causes, and so or it can be something more simple, like if I put my hand in the fire, then that causes pain. So it's an inferential way of thinking. More abstractly, we can, when we're doing things like trying to understand a mathematical theorem, like the Pythagorean theorem, or if we're trying to understand physical laws of the universe, like the law of conservation of matter, we're applying our theoretical wisdom in that sense. And we're engaging in theoretical thinking, which, to the ancient Greeks, they understood that's what they called theoretical nous. Nous translating just as cognition or thinking. And so I guess there's questions we can ask about this. So that's theoretical wisdom, right? And then there is practical wisdom. So practical wisdom is, I'd say it's a combination of theoretical and more pragmatic thinking. And so, I might know that exercise is good for me, and that exercise builds muscles, and that exercise releases endorphins, leads me to feeling good in body and mind, and thereby gratifies my physiological needs, my psychological needs, and so on and so forth. So that's practical wisdom in part, but it's also knowing how to exercise. It's knowing the proper weightlifting techniques, for instance. It's knowing the proper way of running if I'm a runner. It's knowing the proper way of doing a yoga posture or performing a form in Tai Chi or something along those lines. Or being an effective painter or being an effective gardener or landscaper. So it seems like a combination of knowing that something is the case and knowing how to do that. And so we might want to just ask the question, do we think theoretical and practical wisdom are fundamentally separate categories of wisdom? Is there some overlap? Do they kind of, exist on a continuum? What are our views there?
Yeah, I think the idea of a continuum is good. I think in a way, the two help inform one another in a certain sense. I think of theoretical wisdom as thinking about principles. Kind of what you're getting at with they sort of inform, what you want to accomplish in a certain way. And I think practical wisdom kind of allows you to work that into some sort of techne in a form of phronesis. So I don't know if you want to maybe elaborate on the difference between techne and phronesis. I'm not sure if we've done that yet.
Sure, we can briefly. I mean, they're not, I think techne might be a particular facet of phronesis. Phronesis is just practical reason. And practical reason translates as prudence. Prudence is knowing what's good for you. It's the ability to make good practical decisions for yourself, and perhaps for others as well. And techne is a particular skill that you have that relates to a particular activity. So the skill of a painter, or the skill of a landscaper, or the skill of a debater. And so I think that, the craft is a particular, maybe instantiation of prudence, like a particular activity in which prudence manifests itself. And so,
yeah, I think practical wisdom is sort of the marriage of sort of theoretical wisdom. Sort of, practical wisdom is sort of a marriage of theoretical wisdom and a craft or techne in a certain sense. So again, going back to that sort of continuum, you're trying to accomplish a goal, but you're trying to do so in a prudent way, in a way that adheres to certain principles. So we talk about justice, for instance. We want people to be accountable for their actions, but we can't do that. Say, in the Western world, we have the concept of innocent until proven guilty.
right.
I think that's sort of a theoretical sort of form of wisdom. And if we're trying to achieve justice, if you're, a judge trying to decide on the guilt of somebody, your craft is being a judge. In order to have sort of practical wisdom, you have to keep these theoretical concepts. You have to have sort of this theoretical wisdom and these theoretical principles in mind when you're trying to do your craft, and that will give you, a sort of practical wisdom, a particular instantiation of wisdom. I think theoretical wisdom is definitely more general. It's definitely more abstract. But being able to take these abstract concepts and work them into a craft, that's what gives you practical wisdom. So I think philosophy is really trying to develop this theoretical wisdom so that it can be used maybe by yourself or by other people in a particular area, and so that they can become more wise in a practical or pragmatic sense.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that's all well stated. I mean, in a sense, it almost seems as if we translate our theoretical wisdom into practical wisdom, and maybe vice versa. If you're a painter, for example, theoretically, you become acquainted with certain, say, principles, I guess, upon which an effective painter relies upon in painting. Say if you're a Van Gogh or you're a classical Renaissance painter or something, there's certain elements and principles of composition in painting that painting, things like contrast and having certain things in the foreground, certain things in the background, certain things more dominant, other things less dominant. If you're just a commercial painter, you're painting walls and ceilings and stuff. I mean, this kind of speaks to your experience. I'm sure there are certain principles upon which, characterize proper painting technique in that sense, right? And as a landscaper, there are certain principles that are involved in landscaping, certain ways of, trimming grasses and branches and so on and so forth. And so that's sort of a theoretical knowing that something is the case, right? But it also relies upon a more pragmatic knowing how to do those things too. The painter just through habit has internalized the principles and is able to apply the principles without necessarily consciously thinking about them, but they more or less have woven themselves into the painter's painting repertoire, the painter's behavioral repertoire. So more or less just comes naturally and spontaneously without any conscious effort at all.
I think that's really relevant in the development of techniques. Like I don't think Van Gogh or Picasso or whatever was relying on theory per se when, so much theory when they came up with their techniques. But as someone who now, say you want to be someone, a surrealist, in the case of Picasso or something like that. I think he's in the surrealist tradition.
I believe he was a cubist. I think
a cubist.
Salvador Dali was the surrealist.
Surrealist, sure, okay.
Watches and all that.
Yeah, and as someone who studies that, I think you get acquainted with the theory first, and that helps you develop sort of the techne and the practical wisdom. And also, I think too, what theoretical wisdom you rely on depends on where you sit with your craft, with your techne. What tools do you have at your disposal? Like what physical tools, what skills you have will inform what theory you're going to rely on. Sometimes, as a painter, as a painter of houses and things like that, sometimes you don't have all the tools you want, and you're not going to be able to do it in the ideal theoretical way that it would, ideally be done. But there still are theoretical concepts that you can rely on to accomplish your goal. So I think what theories you come up with, what principles you end up applying, are sometimes informed by your techne in a certain sense. Again, what tools you have at your disposal, and that kind of helps develop, say on a job site, what is the practical wisdom here? It might not apply on the next job. It may or may not. But here at this job site, this is the practical wisdom that we're going to rely on to get the job done, and that's informed by the people, their techne, their craft, and the relevant theories that relate to that.
Right. No, I think that's all very well stated. I mean, I feel like thinking of, there's a quote from Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher of the media, something to the effect of, first we shape our technologies, and then our technologies shape us. Mm-hmm. And so, there's this continual reciprocal causal interaction between our tools and the way we think, the way we feel, the way we act. There's this reciprocal interaction between our technologies on the one hand and the way we think about, reality at large, how we think about how to best proceed in achieving a certain goal. These are all shaped by the technologies at our disposal. And so, we rewind in history back to ancient Greece, they were, for transmitting knowledge, for instance, they were limited to the papyrus scroll, right? And it was probably a long, laborious process to copy down abstract ideas onto these scrolls, and then to read them, and to study them, and to transmit them from person to person through the generations. Then in like the Middle Ages, we had Gutenberg, who came around, and he invented the printing press. And suddenly, we could mass produce knowledge at a quicker rate. And we could, that probably sped up knowledge acquisition and facilitated learning a lot more than it did with the papyrus scroll, given, how cumbersome that must have been to have learned that way through reading these papyrus scrolls. Imagine like lugging these huge papyrus scrolls around, trying to like, read the fine print and roll these things out and put them away. And, I definitely be deterred from learning in those technological conditions. But then so after the Gutenberg press came along the electronic media, the internet, and now we can basically transmit information nearly at an instant, and it's kind of fascinating time period we're living in, frankly, because, the ability to acquire knowledge just seems to be accelerating. And, this is shaping the way we perceive the world. This is shaping the way we think about the world. This is shaping the way we act in the world. And so I think your point is spot on in that sense. And I think just to further elucidate and elaborate on this, I think that I think it's a useful distinction insofar as it explains why and how human beings think and feel and act. And theoretical wisdom kind of accounts for how people develop knowledge in order to understand how reality works, and so that they can know cause and effect. And from a naturalistic and evolutionary point of view, this makes a lot of sense. It has adaptive value. Knowing that putting my hand into the fire causes me excruciating pain, was no doubt a useful generalization, the useful principle of cause and effect. And no doubt it helped my ancestors, no doubt that it helps me, no doubt that it'll help my posterity. And so in that sense, yes, I agree with this construct, this construct of theoretical wisdom for those reasons. I also agree with the construct of practical wisdom for somewhat similar reasons. Like I said, knowing that exercise is good for me, that it builds muscles, that it increases endorphins, that it increases mood, and so on and so forth, and that I know how to exercise through using the proper techniques. These are all things that have adaptive significance. And so, yes, I agree. I agree to these constructs. I agree to this way of understanding wisdom. Now, there's this question we need to ask. This is a central question: are theoretical wisdom and practical wisdom mutually exclusive, right? And in my view, these are my reflections. And I think the German poet, scientist, and philosopher Goethe summed it up aptly when he said, "In the beginning was the deed." And this is from his famous play Faust. And I guess such a statement gets to this notion that our knowledge of how something is done precedes our knowledge of why certain things are the way they are. So, first and foremost, we are beings and we are actors in the world, and only maybe secondarily, thinkers and philosophers who think about the world and the nature of reality and so on and so forth. So there might be some primacy to practical wisdom, and that maybe that comes from a developmental and evolutionary perspective. Maybe that comes first, and then we come to develop a more theoretical understanding of the universe. That makes a lot of sense. Think of primitive man, for instance, our hunter-gatherer ancestors. I think for them, in the beginning would have been the deed, right? In the beginning would have been, knowing how to spear a saber-toothed tiger or the antelope on the savannah to avoid getting killed, or for acquiring meat for sustenance. And only secondarily did we understand that, that certain cause-effect relationships were in place. So, for example,
we come to an understanding of why that worked. Why hunting, hunting a certain animal in a certain way, why that was efficient, by reflecting on those things. I definitely am more inclined to that, and it kind of turns the sort of Christian idea of, first was the word on its head. And yeah, I'm definitely more inclined to that disposition of, first we know how to do something. We figure out how to do it, and then we through observation, we learn why things are done in a certain way, sort of from maybe almost like an anthropological perspective. It's like we learn, oh, this is the way that certain cultures engage with the world. Why? Why is it that, when you grow up, you learn, basic ways of behaving. It's the idea of the camel for Nietzsche. First, you transition from you become a camel, so you take on all of these burdens, all of these sort of norms, these normative ways of being, and then you sort of try to reflect on, wait, why am I doing these things these ways? And that might result in certain sort of rejections of tradition. If you can't come up with a particular explanation or justification as to why you're doing things the way that you're doing them. And then hopefully, if you reject them in a certain way, you come up with your own way, or you find your own justification or your own reason for returning to those traditions. If at first it didn't make sense. Yeah, I think that's a good way of summarizing my perspective.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, think about riding a bicycle or something, just something kind of a garden variety example. When you learned to ride a bicycle, did you go read a manual on the mathematical equations that describe the physical principles that explain how it is to ride a bicycle properly? Not necessarily, right? I mean, you in the beginning was the deed, so you get on the bike, and you might be kind of haphazard at first. You get on there and you try to find your balance, and maybe you need training wheels to begin with. So you put on some training wheels, and you start pedaling around the neighborhood, and you develop some comfortability in riding a bike and a sense of balance, and that develops. And you cultivate more practical wisdom in that sense, more phronesis, more techne, if we want to get more specifically, right? And from there, that's the foundation upon which more sophisticated bicycle riding skills are built upon. And so, now maybe I can remove the training wheels and I can get on my bike and find that equilibrium and start pedaling without the need for assistance for longer durations till it gets to the point where I can competently ride my bike without the training wheels. And all of this is just proceeding from action, from kind of a tactile understanding of the mechanics of all of this that can only be learned experientially through our experience, empirically, not necessarily rationally or theoretically. I mean, if I study a book on the physics of riding a bike, that can definitely provide me with maybe a more meta-awareness of what I'm doing, a mindfulness of the mathematics that are at play when I perform this, delicate act, this sensory motor action. But in no way am I kind of consulting my physics textbook while I'm on the bike, trying to navigate around the neighborhood, right?
Yeah, I think that to get at the heart of sort of the stereotype with the philosopher, and kind of turns it on its head a little bit, which is kind of nice. Which is, the stereotype philosopher is, you spend forever thinking about something before you do anything. I think you brought up the idea of changing a light bulb. The stereotypical philosopher sits there and thinks about it all day. I think that that's the best way to do things. but I think I said earlier in some of our preliminary conversations with each other, just sort of a correspondence, that sometimes the most rational way to do something is to just do it, even if it's not the most efficient way, because sitting there and thinking about it all day to find the most efficient, the fastest way to do something, that ends up being less efficient because you've spent the time thinking about it for so long. It's more effective just to act. And this comes with, there's a saying in the trades. I'm not sure if you're aware. You're a landscaper. I think it gets to the heart of this idea that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Instead of sitting there thinking like, oh, well, I gotta make sure it's the right way to do something or whatever. Sometimes it's best, instead of waiting, just to do it. And if there's a better way of doing it in the future, and your boss or your superior wants it done a different way, that's fine. You can do it in the future. But the best way in that moment, without having to ask for permission or having to consult, is just to do it. And later on will come a theory and an understanding of how to do it better in the future.
Makes entire sense to me. I mean, I think that's a good slogan for capturing what we've been saying. I think, there's this saying, right, which is, in trying to strive to succeed, to do something in life, whether it's being a successful painter or landscaper or counselor or philosopher or what have you, there's a saying, get out of your own way.
Yes, absolutely.
But the idea there is that the process of overthinking something is a way that we get in the way of achieving our goals, and in being effective human beings, whether it's a painter or a landscaper or a philosopher or a counselor or a scientist or a midwife or what have you, right? And so it's as if, even though, thinking in some sense is the crowning glory of human beings, we can think, we think, therefore we are, we know that we have self-awareness. In some sense, as Hamlet says in Shakespeare, conscience doth make cowards of us all, right? So, even though consciousness gives us this inward ability to reflect and to contemplate and to ponder, at the same time, it interferes often with action, effective action. Thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought, right? The currents turn awry and they lose the name of action, right? So the energetic currents, in some sense, that energize us to act in certain ways are, in some sense, if we overthink things, they're inhibited and we go wayward, right? And the shit hits the fan. So,
I think too, I guess this kind of gets to another question: is wisdom really, is theoretical wisdom, or the two types of wisdom, are they reducible to one another? Like, do you think theoretical wisdom, kind of that continuum? I guess if you agree, if it's on a continuum, there isn't a real sort of distinction, and in some sense they're reducible. For me, like in some sense, philosophy and this idea of theoretical wisdom, philosophy in itself is sort of a craft. This ability to engage in theoria and to think about things in an abstract manner, that itself is sort of a practice. And it's almost, I think we talked about this, it's somewhat of a meta practice. It's a practice, it's it, it's a practice about, it's a practice in thinking about our practices. And I think that's, in that sense, they do exist on a continuum. Even if they exist on a continuum, and I think that the practical wisdom and the sort of the technique, it acts as like a scaffold at first, like we were talking about, and then eventually there is this sort of reciprocal relationship. We gotta start at the, as Griffith said, at first where's the deed, and we build off of that to get to this meta practice of theoretical wisdom. And once we sort of have that established as a craft, this philosophy, it serves as a meta practice and sort of as like a meta techne.
Sure. I like the way you phrased that. Technique. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's kind of a reflection on our technique, and having developed technique, then we can go back and hone that technique through our creative reflections on how to best perform that technique. So, it's a human ability. It's maybe a unique human ability. It's ability to reflect and to evaluate our performance, to evaluate our application of technique, and to modify it accordingly. Say if I flunk an exam, I'm like, holy shit, what happened? I thought I knew my stuff. I thought I would do really well. Well, I overlooked this in my techne. Maybe I didn't allow for enough sleep. Maybe I wasn't well rested enough. Maybe I didn't space my review over the long term, over weeks rather than cramming in all at the end. And so, I have these various practices in building up to studying for an exam, for example, which after realizing that I committed an error, I can go back through reflection and self-awareness, through theoria, through theorizing, through understanding the cause and effect that was involved in this process, and developing a new understanding of where I went awry, and maybe developing an understanding of what are the causes of a more effective test performance. Maybe get some more sleep. Maybe span my studying out over a few weeks rather than cramming in it all at the end. And maybe the net result will be, hey, I go from a fail to an A+, right? And so such is the nature of theoretical wisdom and practical wisdom, and how it's a dance, it's a dance between the two, it's a tango. And that's why I think you and I would probably agree. They're mutually exclusive in that sense. Although I will admit, there are maybe anomalies. Think of human evolution and how rapid that was. And it almost seems as if there were forces that were guiding that development, that there might have been some kind of outside intervention. That scene from Stanley Kubrick's 2001 at the beginning, where the primitive apes are all, circled around the what do you call it? A monolith, or something like that, right? It's the black the black monolith, right? And it's as if there was some that seems like to be like a metaphor of some alien force that perhaps was there at the dawn of human history, that we downloaded all of this information, and that this gave us these skills too, right? So
I was gonna say aliens.
Maybe there were ancient aliens or something, right? Who knows? This is all for speculation, but philosophically, it's interesting to engage in these kind of flights of fancy, because they kind of highlight the fact that these are complex things to think about. And I myself haven't sorted all of this out and haven't figured it all out. I think that's part of the beauty of philosophy, is that we can be empiricists, and we can acknowledge that knowledge is falsifiable, and it's always continually under revision, right? And so that kind of makes us realize that what we're talking about now and what we consider to be knowledge might hundreds of years from now just seem like, the utterings of primitive troglodytes or something, you know? So yeah, I mean, there's lots to ponder here. Do you have anything to add, or do you want to maybe shift to the next question?
Yeah, we can shift into sort of, what is wisdom, in a broad sense for. I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, being a naturalist and an evolutionist. I think we both are kind of on the same page there as well. And sort of, why is it that we seek wisdom?
Yeah, why do we seek it? I mean, that's the question. That's the pragmatic question. That's the, if we're a pragmatist, we say, what is useful about wisdom in the theoretical and in the practical sense? And I would say there's lots of things that are useful. We've mentioned them throughout the course of our conversation so far. Theoretical and practical wisdom. Theoretical wisdom has predictive value. It allows us, if we can understand cause and effect, then I suppose we can predict what will happen in the future. If we know how the weather, we understand how the weather works. For meteorologists, like the philosopher, I believe is it Anaximenes? I believe he was the first meteorologist. We can come to understand when it's going to rain, when it's not going to rain, when it's going to be hot, when it's not going to be hot, when there's going to be wildfires, when there's not going to be wildfires. If we have practical wisdom, that enables us to adapt to our situation. It enables us to survive. It enables us to flourish as human beings. It enables us to be happy human beings. Not just practical wisdom exclusively, but it's this, again, this interplay between theoretical wisdom and practical wisdom. And these are, kind of interact with each of themselves. There's an interplay. There's a reciprocal causal interaction, as it were. And, that promotes survival, it promotes well-being, it promotes understanding, which in turn promotes survival and well-being. I don't think the two are separate in that way, because I'm a pragmatist and a naturalist and an evolutionist. So promotes both wisdoms promote human survival. They contribute to the gratification of our needs as human beings, our physiological needs, our social needs, our psychological needs. And thereby, those need gratification is one component in being a happy person. So if we gratify our needs, and provided we have the adequate external environment organized in a way that's conducive to happiness, we have a nice house and we have the food we need and so on and so forth, then we're going to be happy people. We're going to be doing well, and we're going to be flourishing as human beings, as Aristotle would put it. So that's my catechism. How about you? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, same perspective on that, really. I think it helps us survive in an environment that's, I'd say, for the most part, fairly hostile towards life. It's, historically, from an evolutionary standpoint, life has been harsh, full of danger. So I think it helps address those challenges. But also, as you alluded to, it helps promote something beyond just survival, but to happiness, to being able to thrive, and to sort of achieve a sort of self-actualization, and a state of being that is optimal. So it's not just about surviving and reproducing, but being able to do so in a way that's optimal, in a way that doesn't needlessly increase our suffering. We can survive in all sorts of ways that amplify suffering. We can do things in a way that, yes, it allows people to survive, but in less optimal conditions. And so I think really what wisdom is about being able to do things, not just do things in the uh, most efficient way, you know, in terms of ones and zeros, you know, living versus dead or whatever, but doing so in a way that's prudent and in a way that really maximizes happiness from, you know, a utilitarian point of view, I guess you could say. It maximizes our utility. Um, I think that's really what wisdom is about, is helping us accomplish things in a way that is optimal, not
Right.
just get the job done, but get it done in a way that satisfies certain principles and certain things that we hold close and we consider to be valuable to us. You know, we can address all sorts of problems, you know, in our life, and we can come up with solutions, but sometimes they come at the detriment to other aspects of our lives. So um, I really think that's what wisdom boils down to, is not just getting things done, but getting them done in the right way, or in a way that is optimal.
Yeah, no, I hardly agree. I mean, you know, I think Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers would agree with you there. You know, I think that wisdom, in some sense, you know, it's not merely to promote survival. You know, it's not merely to um, survive in a Darwinian sense. It's not merely just an adaptation, but it's wisdom is becoming all you can be as a human being. It's the, you know, within an acorn is a mighty oak tree, you know, within a seed is a giant sequoia, and it's through the cultivation of theory and through practice, through habit, that we become who we are, who we are capable of becoming. And so wisdom goes so much beyond just mere survival. But it enhances the quality of our being, you know, in so many different aspects of our lives. And I mean, you could even just see this reflected in the evolution of the human species. I mean, for crying out loud, ages ago we were barbarians, warring with each other and clubbing each other and killing each other, and we were very tribal. Not to say that tribalism is a bad thing. I mean, there's a pejorative sense of tribalism, which is warring with your neighbor, stealing, sacking, pillaging, raping. There's maybe a positive sense of tribalism, which is kind of the global village, like, oh yeah, we're just one big organism of a planet. We're just all, you know, manifestations of consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. Um, and and so what wisdom does is, like, it takes us from this primitive darkness, this barbarism, to this refinement, you know, of being able to articulate our thoughts and to be good to each other and to pursue the ideals of virtue and knowledge and understanding of the universe, and to understand cause and effect, and to, you know, maybe eventually one day, you know, migrate off this planet and to become explorers of the universe and to embody the principles of wisdom. And, you know, so wisdom wisdom really just is this, in some sense, it allows us to transcend, I suppose, our, you know, our finite limitations as human beings, and to evolve, to continue to evolve and to develop and to learn and to grow and to hone our Sophia and to hone our techne forever and forever, you know, as we explore inner space and as we explore outer space. And so, yes, I mean, I would say that that wisdom has a myriad of benefits, not just mere survival, but, enriching and enhancing being in all its complexity.
I think too, there's an aspect of wisdom that I think I may have touched on it a little bit earlier, that in a certain sense it provides somewhat of a why. This philosophy. It's the typical looking at skull why. It provides a why, a reason for doing what we're doing. I think that's incredibly powerful. Like if you look at Viktor Frankl, and
Man's Search for Meaning.
Pardon me. Yeah. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and he quotes Nietzsche, and he says, Nietzsche says, a man who has a why can bear almost any how. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Wisdom. It gives us a reason to do things. It reminds us of why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing it. It gives us sort of principles. It reminds us of these principles for well-being, for overcoming challenges in our lives. So I think that wisdom and that why, even in some of the harshest conditions like Viktor Frankl had in these concentration camps, it can help preserve your happiness, and it can, even in those circumstances, it can help you live, even in some of the most precarious situations. It can help you live a happy life. It can help you even thrive in these environments, insofar as that's possible. It can, the difference between the people that made it and that didn't. People that didn't make it through these concentration camps, a lot of the times he said that they had no reason to live anymore. Thinking about people who their whole family is gone. They've been sort of exterminated, and there's really nothing left for them. So, yeah, I think the idea of wisdom really does provide, philosophical wisdom, and just being able to remind yourself why you're doing what you're doing can really provide some sort of strength and allow you to, again, not just survive, but do well in life.
Yes, as you've aptly put it before, not just to survive, but to thrive, right? Mm-hmm. And I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's very potent to be able to find meaning, even in the most dire circumstances. If you're a concentration camp inmate, for example, it's very potent for survival purposes, and for to be able to endure unavoidable suffering. And I think in some sense, there's a meaning to everything. I don't think, anything happens necessarily by accident, but there's kind of maybe a providence to everything. There's a why to everything, and things don't happen to us, they happen for us. And even though on the surface of it might seem like hell, like if you're in the concentration camp in Viktor Frankl's circumstances, or whether it's something just kind of more happenstance, like, you forgot to take the garbage out on Tuesday night, and therefore, you have a pile of garbage now that's going to be sitting around, in your garage for 2 weeks until you wait till the next garbage pickup. These things happen for us. So when we, for example, commit an error, we make a mistake, we slip up, that's the universe telling us that we need to get our shit together.
So this reminds me of Sartre. I believe it has this quote. I can't remember which work it was in, but it says, we get the war we deserve. Referring to World War II, in the sense that there's some responsibility for whatever happens to you. In that sense, nothing just happens to you. If there's that responsibility, you get the war you deserve. There means, it's something you're somehow still, as what we would call a victim, a participant in these things. And there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down another time. But, you talk about, personal responsibility, things, people would say, certain ideas of shaming people. Say someone has unwanted attention, say at a club or a bar, you make a comment about, or some sort of unwanted interaction or something. It's important to maybe bring up, you can't control other people's actions, but what you can control is what situations you put yourself in. You're going to a place where you can't control other people's actions, and people might have nefarious intentions or inappropriate intentions. And so maybe dressing a certain way, drinking to the point of blacking out or inebriation isn't a good position to put yourself in. Not that it's necessarily your fault that something bad happened, but that there is still a responsibility to keep yourself safe. It's like the idea of wearing your seatbelt. It might not be your fault that the accident happened, but you still have a or that an accident, but you still have a responsibility to wear your seatbelt to protect yourself and to make sure that, your airbags are working or whatever it is. So that it's not, you're not suffering, or you're not going through this, instance, and, it's so just so that it's not worse than it needs to be. It's okay to take risks in life, but you need to be prudent about the risks that you take and understand that you are taking those risks.
Right. Yeah, by virtue of us being human beings, this endows us with certain powers, certain degree of wisdom, as it were, and what this entails for us, pragmatically, is that we are morally responsible, that we have a locus of control for what goes on in our environments, that we can affect what happens. To some limited extent, we can choose how things will unfold. If I go to a club or a bar and I get inebriated, and then I get a bit rowdy and I instigate some kind of, quarrel with another inebriated individual at the bar, and this eventuates into some kind of stereotypical bar fight of throwing beer bottles and going at each other with chairs and so on and so forth. This would be the situation that we deserve, that we you reap what you sow. But what I reap in this case isn't something that I would like to avoid because of the obviously the destructive consequences of this event. So, in that sense, I think we have to be responsible actors in the world, and we have to use our locus of control in the most optimal manner. And maybe those things are manifesting, wisdom in the best sense of the word, and that maybe underscores what wisdom is for in a certain sense. That wisdom is for having harmonious social relationships with other people at the bar, so you can go to the bar and enjoy your drink and toast your glass to the person next to you and enjoy the night. Maybe enjoy some dancing on the dance floor afterwards, after you've loosened up a bit after a few drinks. And all this can be conducted civilly because, insofar as we cultivate theoretical and practical wisdom, we can embody that wisdom in that sense, in those practical situations.
I think that brings us kind of really close to our next question, which is, what is the love of wisdom, or sorry, how does the love of wisdom manifest itself in action, in terms of praxis? What do you have to say about that?
Well, quite a bit actually, but for the purposes of, keeping this within a reasonable time limit, I'll try to distill it down to the essential points. So I think that we, praxis, of course, is the Greek term for action. And so, the question is that how does the love of wisdom manifest itself in action in praxis? And what I think is that when we embody wisdom, we act intentionally. We act with a goal in mind, for example. We don't, necessarily act merely to gratify our short-term impulses, but we act in congruence with a long-term goal. So the textbook example that I thought of was that of the licentious partier, who, although he parties every Friday night, and he's a party animal for all intents and purposes, he goes to the Sticky Wicket and he downs 10 pints.
For those who don't know, the Sticky Wicket is a popular pub in Victoria where there's typically police outside arresting somebody for something.
Yes, you described it pretty aptly there. And then this guy goes to Lucky, which is a bar and club in Victoria, and he goes there afterwards, and he dances the night away until last call, and then he goes to 7-Eleven after and eats hot dogs and gets chili stains all over his shirt and wakes up and wonders what the hell happened. But nonetheless, he has enough theoretical wisdom and practical wisdom to do good enough to do well on the MCATs and get accepted to medical school, right? So he gets into medical school, and to succeed in med school, you have to have a necessary discipline. You have to be able to regulate those impulses to go out partying on a Friday night if you're to succeed, and and to make the grade to get through medical school. And so, I think this is a good example of things are looking a bit static there, buddy. But I think this is a good example of how to embody wisdom in action. The prospective doctor in training, has to relinquish their desire to be the party animal and to go out every Friday night, and they need to exercise some degree of practical wisdom, some degree of prudence, to act in a way that is useful for you and that's going to contribute to your long-term happiness, not necessarily the gratification of your short-term goals. And this can be extended to other examples in life, of course, too. I just kind of used a kind of textbook example.
Yeah. But more Apollo, less Dionysus.
Yeah, exactly. Seeing the light, seeing the reason. So there's other examples that we could talk about. I mean, making good financial decisions. The licentious partier. Maybe it's more prudent for him not to go out on the Friday as well because it's going to save him some money. Which he can save for a new car.
Or his student loans.
Student loans, right? Pay back those student loans, which hopefully you can pay back after 5 years of medical school. And there's so these are some of the instances in which that the love of wisdom can manifest itself in action. And in these instances, in striving to manifest the love of wisdom in action, ultimately what the wise person is doing is striving towards a particular end. And in the case of human beings, the particular end we're striving towards is happiness, which is, doing well, acting well, in all its complexity. And so in that sense, we're, embodying wisdom. We're striving towards happiness, and we're striving towards happiness, at least in Aristotle's view, for its own sake. And so we want to gratify our needs as human beings. This is part of the equation, right? We want to gratify our physiological needs, our psychological needs, our social needs, and in order to do well, to act well, which translates to eupraxia in ancient Greek, I should say. And so doing well and acting well is what constitutes happiness. And it's in Aristotle's view, it's pursued for its own sake and for the sake of, and not for the sake of something else. So, I gratify my needs as a human being, and that's a component in being a happy person. And once I'm a happy person, there's nothing else I'm really looking for beyond that. And so, I've attained well-being, but it's not a static end necessarily. I'm a happy person. I'm doing well in life. I get up and, I exercise, I go for a run, make a good breakfast. I go to work, and I kick ass at work. I'm competent. I'm effective. I feel totally actualized as a human being, and so that's not necessarily a fixed endpoint, a static process, but it's almost as if it's a dynamic process, which involves kind of a continual sustenance and maintenance for me to be happy. I need to sustain and maintain that through what I'm doing. And I can't necessarily be doing the same things over and over again. I might have to change what I do because I'm an evolving organism, of course. But I'm embodying action for the purposes of being a happy person. And I think that's really, in some sense, what embodying wisdom involves and what it's contributing towards. So you want to maybe add your own little flourish to that as well?
Yeah, I think, as we grow up, from being an infant, I think the first thing that comes about is, our basic needs, if you're thinking in terms of the Maslow's hierarchy. We don't necessarily grow up looking for self-actualization. Well, we're striving for it, but it's not something that's attainable. But I still think we can be happy. I for some reason I have this inclination, and maybe it's from my time spent reading Nietzsche, that happiness is in some sense sort of the foundation for developing things like virtue. So if you have a child that has the basic needs met, is clothed, is in a good environment that's safe and secure, with the family, parents, you're going to have a happy child, and you're going to be able to teach them how to act and behave in a virtuous manner. And if you have a virtuous person, then they're going to be able to develop reason and to be able to think with clarity. And so I think, in a way, I know we kind of, I was humming and hawing about what order these things go in. And I think I've kind of settled, at least in this moment, on the idea that happiness is primary in a certain sense. Maybe not happiness in the sense that Aristotle conceives it. This sort of eudaimonia, this sort of self-actualization conception of happiness, but maybe a little bit more of a primitive primordial happiness where needs are met, basic needs, maybe close all the way to self-actualization. All those things are met. And in order to achieve sort of this self-actualization, you need happiness. You need happiness, and that will lead to you being able to learn how to behave virtuously. It will help you develop virtuous, virtuous disposition. And as you get older, and as you're able to develop your reason, it'll, being virtuous, being happy, this will give you sort of a foundation for thinking rationally, for thinking with clarity. If you're someone who grew up in an environment that is very hostile, your needs aren't met, you're going to behave in ways that are troubling, that are not desirable. I work with populations in my field where this really seems to be the case, which is their needs were never met. They've never had the chance to live a happy childhood, so to speak. And so their behaviors are very troubling. We could say that they have underdeveloped virtues. And certainly as they get older, you see that their way of reasoning about the world is very, at least from my perspective, very askew. They think about things in a very strange way, in a way that's not quote unquote normal. And their ability to think through problems, especially social problems, and understand the world is very much distorted. So, to a large extent, I think there's as we keep going back to a reciprocal interaction between these things. I think if, you're someone who's happy, it helps you be virtuous, and being virtuous will increase your happiness because you're behaving in a way that's in accordance with other people, what they want, so that'll help increase your happiness, increase your virtue. And same with the reasoning. You can reason and work through problems, and that'll help increase your virtue and your happiness. And it's more of a circle. But I think the starting point, in a certain sense, is happiness. I think that's really sort of primary, at least from my perspective.
Right. And that's an interesting way of explaining it causally, from an explanatory perspective, because typically many people, at least intuitively, might be inclined to think that, first of all, we become a virtuous person and we develop our capacity to reason, and then we develop our skills and abilities, and then those are the preconditions for becoming a happy person. And so you've just kind of inverted it in some sense. You think that in some sense happiness is primary, being well and doing well is in some sense primary, and it's from that state that we are able to develop our rational faculties and to become virtuous people. If I've correctly understood you.
Yeah. And in some sense, I think I'm almost replacing virtue with self-actualization. If a virtuous, someone who's self-actualized has their virtues in order, there's a sort of a temperance there with their virtues.
Okay. So insofar as self-actualization is a component of happiness, the person who has become self-actualized, who has, become all they can be as a human being, insofar as they've done that, then They've, well, how would you put it?
Can you just recap what you said there? You said
I've achieved self-actualization.
Mhm.
I've become, the ideal person I'm capable of becoming. So what follows from that?
Well, I think that that's that helps you. That'll
It helps you be more virtuous.
Yeah, I think so. If you're someone who is happy, you're able to develop a virtuous disposition. You're able to increase your virtue, or you're able to establish, a virtuous disposition, and then you're able to develop a rational disposition. You're able to reason about certain situations that you find yourself in, and that'll in turn help you, like, so if you're happy as a kid, you can at least establish some semblance of virtue. It doesn't need to be perfect temperance of those virtues at the beginning. And once you're able to establish a virtuous disposition, you can reason clearly, you can help further actualize your virtues, and then back to the happiness where it feeds back into the happiness, which you're able to be happier than you were before. So it's happiness, virtue, reason. You're able to reason about your virtues, figure out how to become more temperate, how to in any particular circumstance make the right decision, and then again back into the happiness, which is it elevates yourself in that sense, and it just is sort of like a feedback. You start from happiness, virtue, reason, back to virtue, back to happiness. So it's
Okay.
like, yes, kind of think of the arrows kind of going both ways there.
Yeah. No, I'm kind of getting the thrust of your argument here. I mean, I'm kind of almost thinking about this like developmentally, like
Yes, that's exactly the way I'm thinking. Like, from when you're a kid, like,
yeah,
how do people grow up?
yeah, like from a developmental psychology perspective, like we have
Yeah,
as developing organisms, we have these critical periods of our development, right?
yeah,
Uh, you know, periods in which the organism, the human being, can more be easily influenced than in other periods in development. And so we call these periods critical periods, right? Periods in which, if something's going to happen, it has to happen at this time, in our development. So learning languages, for example, there's a certain developmental window in which you can best learn a language. And beyond that point, it's going to be very hard to learn a language like English or French or Spanish. And one of the processes that operates in these situations is often referred to as imprinting, right? There are certain narrow windows in which in which we are imprinted with a particular, we are imprinted by our environment, which shapes who we become. Certain, some of the ethologists, for example, like I think it was Conrad Lorenz, and
that's exactly the guy I was thinking when he said imprinting.
yeah. So some others, conducted experiments with birds, and birds who are not shown their maternal mother at a certain period of their development won't be able to recognize their mother when they're around, right? So, therefore, what scientists do is they hold up a puppet of a swan, for example, say if they're swans. And so in order to imprint them properly. So, it's a critical period of learning for an organism. Not even just learning, but I know cats, for example, if you sew their eyes shut during a critical period of development, that their eyes won't be able to develop their visual acuity in the same way as it, compared to the normal condition where they have regular eyesight, So our minds, I suppose, are these incredible recorders. And at these critical periods, they record reality in a certain way according to what stimuli they're exposed to. And then that stimuli goes on to shape their being on a perceptual level and on a maybe physiological level, on a behavioral level. And it's very hard to undo this imprinting after it's happened. So, thinking of, for example, the child who grows up in the orphanage and they're deprived of a lot of their basic human needs growing up, and they're anything but happy, they're going to struggle with, cultivating virtue, and they're going to struggle with developing all of their faculties as a human being. But if they have an enriching childhood, where, they're given affection, their physiological needs are taken care of, they're well fed, and so on and so forth, well, it would seem that they're going to be happier at that stage. And because they're happier at that stage, that serves as the foundation upon which they can develop into more, wiser people, more virtuous people, perhaps.
Yeah, it was something I kind of came up with on somewhat on the fly there. Like I wasn't too sure, where I sat on that relationship. So apologies if it was a bit confusing, but I think you got it there, especially like that enriching environment being essential to developing someone who's virtuous and is able to reason about things properly, and end up becoming sort of an agent in their own development, in their own virtue, and in their own happiness. I think that reason aspect is sort of tied into that being an autonomous agent. You see that a lot in different philosophical traditions.
Right. Yeah, you do see that in lots of philosophical traditions, and you see it in in psychology and developmental psychology, and I think it just underscores the importance of developmental periods and being careful. If you're planning on having kids one day, or someone who's planning on having kids, to advise them, that it's important that you nurture these needs at an early stage or at the critical stages. Otherwise their development could go awry, right? So I think I think that gets to the crux of a lot of this, of how is it that we embody wisdom, and why do we embody it that way? So where are we right now? We're on to, you want to go on to the golden mean? I think that was, we hit home on some interesting insights there. I guess the next question to ask is, do we agree with the doctrine of the golden mean? And is it you think it's a useful concept for seeking to understand the nature of philosophy? So, certain philosophers like Plato and Bertrand Russell kind of apply the doctrine of the mean in kind of an epistemological sense. So, in Plato, for example, the golden mean, insofar as it applies to philosophy, he understands it in terms of the philosopher being kind of the mean between two extremes. So on one extreme, we have somebody who's ignorant. And on the other extreme, we have somebody who is wise. So we have someone who's completely ignorant and someone who's completely wise. And for Plato, the philosopher is somebody who's in the middle. He represents the mean.
Does he use those terms? Why does he use the term wise?
He uses the term wise, yes. So the philosopher is someone who's an intermediary between complete ignorance and complete wisdom. So do we want to agree with that characterization of the philosopher or philosophy more broadly? So, I mean, I can offer my own reflections. I think it's a fairly good characterization of a philosopher. I mean, at least in Plato's sense is the philosopher is moderates between complete ignorance and complete wisdom, and that so in that sense, the philosopher embodies in an epistemological sense, in the sense of knowing about the world. The philosopher is someone who is, on an epistemological level, he's someone who has humility. He recognizes the limitations of his knowledge, that he doesn't know everything. So in some sense, he's partly ignorant, because he knows that there are things that he doesn't know. And indeed, there might be some things that he doesn't even know that he doesn't know. Another can of worms.
He's starting to sound like what is his name? Was it Dick Cheney or something like that? There's the things we know, then there's the things we know we don't know, and then there's the unknown unknowns.
All right. Wasn't that Donald Rumsfeld?
Oh yeah, Donald Rumsfeld. I knew it was one of the neocon ghouls, as they people like to call them. There's. I think I kind of want to use wisdom, like maybe an artificial distinction, but maybe just helpful, which is there's ignorance, there's being all knowing, like sort of like a god, like God. And then there's wisdom, which is knowing things and then knowing that there's things that you don't know. And I think someone who's wise knows what they know and knows what they don't know and acknowledges that there's going to be things that they don't even know that they don't know.
Right.
I think that's sort of, in my opinion, the definition of being a wise person, which is, being cautious and prudent about knowledge, about your statements, about truth, about matters. You're someone who is considerate. You consider things, you think about things to a large extent, but you don't sit on these things and take them necessarily as certain, at least for the most part. You leave this room for error. This kind of goes back to Aristotle's definition of intelligence. It's the ability to entertain an idea without accepting it. And I think that's a good characterization of a philosopher, is that they're able to understand, acknowledge, consider certain ideas, but they don't have to accept them as truth. But it's interesting to try them on and to see if they fit. In areas where maybe you're missing knowledge, and there's things that you want to understand.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the hammer. You hit the nail with the hammer there. I think, in some sense, being a wise person is to be able to suspend your belief, and to temporarily suspend what it is that you think is to be the case in order to consider maybe the opposite to what you entertain. And, we can see this reflected, I think, even just in the history of human ideas and in the evolution of human thought. And, you think of paradigm shifts, Thomas Kuhn's term, where we shift our fundamental worldview, like we the one worldview replaces another worldview, which we see throughout history. So at one point in history, we think that the Earth is flat, and suddenly Columbus comes around, and he discovers continents where we thought that the Earth ended. So this leads to a whole new understanding of the world, which is that the world is actually round. And then we have the scientific revolutions, right? And we have Copernicus figuring out that we're not the center of the universe, but that we actually rotate around the sun. That is. And then we have Newtonian physics, eventually giving way to Einsteinian physics, Not to say that Newtonian physics is to be abandoned completely, it's good for certain applications, but Einsteinian physics explains a lot of things that Newtonian physics can't explain. So that just shifts our perception in that sense. And so therefore, tying this all together, I think you have to have that epistemic humility in that sense. You can't think you have it all figured out. You have to be able to, Bertrand Russell also has this great term of hypothetical sympathy. You have to, in understanding any philosopher's philosophy, or this could even be extended to other thinkers too, like a scientist or someone, you have to be able to sympathize with their worldview to understand why it is that they believe whatever it is to be the case, what are their reasons, and to maybe even just empathize with what it feels like to be that person. That gives you a new perspective on things, and maybe it might even spur you to change your way of looking at things, having adopted a different way of looking at things, or at least seeing that a particular perspective is valid from that person's frame of reference. This is something counselors do, like the famous counselor Carl Rogers kind of emphasizes, right? To be able to take on the other person's frame of reference and to recognize that their frame of reference is valid insofar as that, say they're depressed. Well, they're depressed because all this shit in their life happened, and you can take on that frame of reference and you can see that reason why they behave the way they are, the way they think and feel and behave the way they are, is because because they had maybe a traumatizing childhood or something like that. So now they're chronically feeling sad all the time, and they're lethargic, and they can't get motivated to do things that give them pleasure, and so on and so forth, right? So there's immense value in this ability, to take on a different perspective, to take on a different point of view, to suspend your beliefs and your presuppositions and so on, right? And maybe that's what being wise is. And I guess that validates what we've been talking about as far as epistemic humility goes, and that the philosophers is, this in between point between, total ignorance and total wisdom. He's somewhere in between. He doesn't have it all figured out. We can think of this in more Aristotelian terms. For Aristotle, the mean was had ethical implications, right? So, to be a philosopher is to kind of be the mean between the extremes of excess and deficiency, insofar as we apply these to the virtues. So, someone who's courageous, he's somewhere in between, say, fearfulness and rashness, right? He's in the middle, maybe he has a little bit of fear, which is healthy, keeps him alert, keeps him aware of the risks involved in a particular situation, but he's not overpowered by that fear. It's not excessive, and he's not too rash, he doesn't think, that he's a god, that he can, that a certain situation that has an element of, say, calculated risk or something, that's not going to be stressful. It probably will be stressful, but, the courageous person is someone who can act and do what they think is right in spite of feeling that fear, and not get also carried away by thinking they're too competent at doing something, but they're able to maintain that balanced, that mean between those two extremes. Um, so, I mean, I happen to agree with that. I think, I think we need to be in a place of equilibrium, and a place of balance in order to be, operating at our best, to be, if we're going to exercise our theoretical wisdom and our practical wisdom to the optimal, we need to be in this mean point, this point at which, our virtues are we're neither being excessive in the way that we think and feel and act. We're being neither deficient in the way we think and feel and act, but we're somewhere in the middle. So, and we can apply this to all the virtues. We can apply this to prudence, to temperance, to courage, to justice, to compassion. We could go on and on with the list of things, right?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, too, a lot of this is individualized. It's particular to individuals. What is courageous for an adult might be reckless for a child. There's certain things that require a certain amount of individual consideration. I don't think there's a golden mean for what it means to be a philosopher in terms of wisdom and ignorance, or what it means to be courageous in terms of recklessness and cowardice. As far as there's no sort of standard that fits everyone. I mean, there's good maybe generalizations for what these things mean, but I think we really have to take it down to individual considerations. What space do people occupy? And if we could do that, if we can reflect on ourselves and realize like what our limitations are, that's how we're kind of going to get to that golden mean. And there isn't, again, some sort of set standard that's going to determine like, oh, I need to live up to this. This is what it means to be courageous. I think that there's things that would be courageous for some people that are just everyday actions for others. And I think that's important to acknowledge.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with this. I mean, I think what you're getting at in some sense, it's nuanced, but I think partly of what you're getting at here is that, the wise person adopts an internal locus of evaluation. Mm-hmm. So they're not evaluating themselves according to, say, certain external standards, but they're evaluating themselves and how they act in the world and according to certain internal standards. And, in that sense, they're comparing themselves to who they are today rather than to who someone else was yesterday. They base their concept of what it is to be virtuous upon, what it is to be virtuous to them relative to their temperament, relative to their personality, whether relative to their particular aptitudes and skills as human beings. And, it might be particularly based upon the individual person and their like idiosyncrasies. And I think it also could do, like you pointed out, it could depend upon developmental considerations. So, we might hold a lower standard of courage, say, for the young child who's like learning to swim, and they're timid about jumping into the deep end. But they feel the fear, but they end up doing it anyway. And so we say they embodied courage in that sense. They were neither, overly fearful, and they were not overly rash. They had a little bit of fear, and they had a general sense that they were competent. And so in that sense, the way we appraise the situation, the way in which we evaluate whether or not they are virtuous in that sense, whether or not they're courageous, we do so in a way that's dependent upon their developmental stage. You know, in comparison to say someone who is a high diver, you know, who's a cliff diver or dives off, you know, dives into the ocean from, you know, huge heights and so on and so forth. To perform such an action, you know, would not seem to be an instance of courage, right? Because they have I guess their courage for them to qualify as courage, it would have to meet certain conditions, you know, that are more or less, you know, push the threshold of their level of comfort in some sense, you know. So it seems like, you know, our concept of virtue is partly dependent upon, you know, the person and their stage of development, and, you know, therefore what we consider to be virtuous in one case is not virtuous in another case, and so on and so forth. That's me kind of sort of paraphrasing what you said and adding a bit of my own, you know, ideas to that as well. So,
do we want to move on to Russell's no man's land metaphor?
Yeah, we can move on to that. So Bertrand Russell famously describes philosophy as this no man's land. So you know, the no man's land is just a term taken from warfare, which is, you know, in World War I, you know, the war was fought in the trenches. So you'd have one enemy at one trench and another enemy at another trench, and you know, both participants in the war would move over the trenches into this no man's land, which was neither the territory of one group or the other. And so Russell, who had lived through the First World War, you know, was probably inspired by that. And he comes up with this metaphor that philosophy is this no man's land. And, you know, on one side of the no man's land is religion. You know, on one side of the trench is religion. On the other side of the trench is science. And so philosophy, according to him, is this mean between those two extremes, between religion and between science. So how are we to make sense of that? And do we agree with this metaphor? Well, the way I kind of interpret it, again, is kind of like in this epistemological sense, that in some sense, you know, religion deals with its own subject matter. You know, it's concerned with the divine, it's concerned with value, it's concerned with meaning, it's concerned with the purpose of existence. And then science is often concerned with, you know, how does reality work? How does it all operate? What are the principles of cause and effect, and so on and so forth. And then philosophy almost seems to be in the middle there, considering maybe aspects of both extremes. You know, they're kind of, the philosopher is concerned with questions of meaning and value, just as the theologian is. But the philosopher is also concerned with questions of how did this all happen? What is the cause and effect at play, and so on and so forth. So Russell thinks that the philosopher is somewhere in between all of this. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean that the philosopher is considered with things that haven't been quite settled yet by either religion or science. Therefore, it's this no man's land. It's this land in which kind of things are up for grabs. And it's this hypothetical place of possibilities, perhaps. You know, maybe the philosopher is he who comes up with our concepts of the world. And then it's up to the scientists to test those concepts. The philosopher maybe also might come up with ideals of, you know, what is the virtuous life. So he's considering possibilities that, you know, are traditionally handled by, you know, the theologian, insofar as the theologian is concerned with coming up with answers to the question of what's the meaning of it all, what's the value of it all, and so on and so forth. So the philosopher occupies this middle point, this mean between the extremes in that sense. So I guess the question is, do we agree with that metaphor? And I guess we can kind of maybe think about this in terms of stages of, you know, how our knowledge develops. And, you know, maybe it's the case that religion comes first in the development of thinking. So, the theologian is someone who, like the priest or the shaman or somebody, there's someone who experiences a divine revelation. For example, that there's a unity among all organisms. There's kind of an energy or a force that underlies everything. And, based on that understanding, they come to the realization, okay, well, maybe everything is one. Maybe there's this, maybe there's an energy, call it God or something, that underlies everything. And then perhaps after that, the philosopher comes along and steps onto the scene and says, well, maybe we can explain the same thing metaphysically and rationally. So maybe the existence of God, that's presented itself through divine revelation, can also be explained in terms of principles of logic and reason. So, nothing can come from nothing, right? There has to be a cause of what is. There has to be a cause of the universe. So Aristotle thought of this as the prime mover, the uncaused cause. And from that everything else develops. So now we're making sense of the divine revelation of that God exists, but we're making sense of it rationally and philosophically. And then maybe the scientist wants to step onto the scene and say, hey, quantum physics tells us that everything, matter and energy, are just kind of the same thing. And it's just a different, when matter ceases to be, it just is converted to energy and vice versa. And
it's a matter of energy, man.
yeah, it's matter and energy, right? So we have this developmental perspective that we could take in thinking about this. And so maybe the philosopher is somebody who stands in the middle, who wants to just think about this rationally and conceptually. The theologian is somebody who wants to just think about this in terms of revelation, not necessarily reason, but revelation, which is kind of a flash of insight that doesn't come through reason, but which just comes from being receptive to the divine. It's something that happens to you, I suppose. And then the scientist comes along and says, okay, how is all of this working? What equations can we use to explain this? What kind of cosmological argument can we come up for all of this? So I don't know if I've done justice to what Russell was actually trying to explain here, but this is kind of how I've made sense of it. I don't know if you're on board with any of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think all three, religion, philosophy, science, are all trying to provide explanations of the world. And I think there are various different stages and attempts at doing that. And I'm thinking it in terms of different gradations of certainty and faith. You start at religion. I think I would argue, and a lot of people would argue, that some explanation, even if it relies on faith, is better than none. That way you have some sort of organization and consistency and predictability in your environment. And I think that's where religion really comes into place. A lot of it is faith. And I think, that's fine. And then philosophy, especially if you look at the works of Kant, he's trying to really make science, and in particular metaphysics, a complete and certain science, the queen of all sciences. That's the goal, to provide certainty for this sort of thing. And I think it does occupy somewhat of a middle ground, a no man's land, so to speak, where there's a degree of certainty, but there still are fundamental principles that you have to take for granted in a certain sense, take on faith. And I think that's that's just sort of the case. And I think science is maybe half step above that, from philosophy, where again, there are still certain principles that we just have to take for granted, that we have to just sort of assume. Less so than, I'd say, most philosophies, but I think science, to a large extent, relies on a certain philosophical conception of the world. In particular, Newton's physics, relies on a materialistic, causal sort of conception, a physicalist conception of the world. And that entails having to just accept as brute fact certain things. But I think from that you can derive observations. You can conduct, experiments that get to these observations that provide a level of certainty that just hasn't been seen before. And I think, again, they kind of sit on a continuum. We keep going back to this idea of a continuum from uncertainty and faith, referencing religion, to certainty, where we get to science. I don't think we've arrived at complete and certain, anything complete and certain, but science is the best we have, and it might be the best we ever get. I'm not sure I'm not sure there's anything we could be certain about, to the foundation. I'm not sure that that's possible, but insofar it is possible, insofar it's possible to get close to that ideal of certainty, I think science does the best job.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the history of science is one of, continually shifting paradigms through continual revisions of knowledge, through abandoning what we thought was certain and replacing with newly discovered truths, which then become more certain for us. I like the metaphor of the continuum personally. I don't necessarily see theology and metaphysics and science as being in fundamental opposition to one another. In fact, I maybe they form this kind of holy trinity or something. And I think that in some sense, I think all human beings have a revelatory experience, maybe an experience that seems to be ineffable in some sense. It's hard to put it in words. And it's an experience that doesn't seem to be coming from us, but something that's happening to us. Maybe it's the perception of the unity of all living beings or something. And as philosophers, we're tasked with the challenge of making sense of that, maybe on a conceptual level. And maybe it is kind of as Plato pointed out, maybe there is this transcendental world of forms and of spirits and of entities and so on and so forth. And the philosopher is he who has an open enough mind to be receptive to these things, and then to articulate them and make sense of them rationally. For example, goodness or love or things like that. Maybe these are qualities and feelings that are maybe divine in origin. Maybe they come from the top down, as it were, and we're more or less conduits for these perceptual experiences. And philosophers have talked about this a lot. But then the scientist comes along and maybe through the tools of the trade is able to, explain and predict the relationships which account for those experiences. In quantum physics, there's the double slit experiment, right? So it's the actual activity of perceiving the neuron determines whether it's a particle or a wave, right? So how does that tie back to everything? Well, I guess the way that we perceive that fundamental reality, whether that's a spiritual reality or whatever, it's partly dependent upon the mechanisms of perception. So to the extent that we can perceive the divine, that's affected by how the act of perception itself, and what the conditions are, and so on and so forth. So, I don't know if this is making any sense, but I'm trying to tie all these different threads together. What I'm just trying to get to, I guess, at bottom is that the scientist is trying to explain how it is that we have maybe these revelatory experiences, these mystical experiences, how, and then the philosophers may be trying to explain why we have them from a more conceptual standpoint. And then the theologian is more or less just kind of concerned with the experience as such. And, that's what the scriptures are about, and that's what the Vedic texts are about, and so on and so forth. But again, these are fuzzy boundaries, and it's hard for me, I guess, in part to draw a rigid distinction between theology and philosophy and religion in some sense.
Yeah. Especially the philosophy, and all of them, kind of depends on what perspective you're taking. I see a lot of overlap with religion and philosophy, especially on when you're trying to provide meaning to life. The existentialists are really trying to fill that void, after the fall of religion. It's trying to fill that existential void. You look at Nietzsche, talking about the death of God, and what are we supposed to do after that? Once all those sort of values are gone. So there's that, and then there's the philosophy, which really tries to question some of the assumptions of science, particular materialism. So yeah, I think it kind of takes a critical perspective towards both, and in that sense, it really does occupy sort of this middle ground.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think we've maybe expressed the same thing in different ways, or at least agreed to at least some ways in which philosophy occupies the middle ground. So maybe it is a good metaphor in some sense. Maybe the metaphor needs some updating, because we're not going through times of trench warfare these days, but warfares of different varieties. And I don't know, maybe the new no man's land is the internet or something, where everything is kind of in a state of anarchy, and philosophy occupies that state of anarchy, maybe. But in any case, maybe we can shift to our final question discussion for the salon today, which is just to get into the final question of our discussion here. Is just this perennial question is, what is the value of philosophy? Why should we study it from a historical perspective? Because of course, the philosophy of salons in part is about the historical coverage of philosophy, Western and Eastern, from its beginnings to the modern times. So why should we engage in this process? So these are my own reflections. I think the value of philosophy is that it allows us to cultivate wisdom in both the theoretical and the practical sense. And ultimately, this leads us to become happier people. And I think philosophy should be studied from a historical perspective, because it increases both our theoretical and our practical wisdom. And more specifically, I believe it increases my knowledge, your knowledge, that there is a multiplicity of factors in the world that we inhabit that shape our ideas. And these could be social factors, biological factors, psychological factors, It's a complex situation here. And one way I've been thinking about this lately is in terms of personality. So I think personality factors play a large part in shaping the world. It's our personalities, the particular personalities we have are the preconditions upon which we form certain ideas. So, if we can think about this in terms of temperament, in terms of our inherent biology. The ideas we will tend to endorse and subscribe to will be dictated by our biology. They'll also be dictated by our personality traits, which are partly biological, but they're also partly learned on the basis of our experience. So, one way of looking at this is in terms of, say, the Big Five personality model. So people who aren't familiar with that, the acronym CANOE typically is used to describe the Big Five personality characteristics, right? So we have conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, extroversion,
and openness.
Openness, right?
Yeah. It's funny, you guys go canoe. The one I'm familiar with is ocean. I didn't realize that the ocean and canoe had the same letters.
They basically get to the same thing, right? But
yeah, it's interesting. I've never heard the canoe example.
Yeah, I kind of like it because I'm kind of a canoe person myself. I'm Canadian, and Canadians like canoes, and so I endorse that. But in any case, examining these traits. Let's take conscientiousness, for example. Somebody who's conscientious, for instance, will maybe tend to formulate ideas that are of right and wrong. So they they're very scrupulous people, and they believe that people should adhere to their principles and not deviate and commit wrongs on someone else, but they should be benevolent and they should be just and fair with others, and that they shouldn't be too loose with that they should, consistently adhere to these principles. So they're going to be maybe more moralistic in their thinking, and their ideas are going to be, say, more oriented towards being a moral human being. So they might endorse ideas that one ought to strive to be a good person, insofar as that's possible. Someone perhaps who is a bit more open and creative, they're going to tend less to endorse ideas that conform to, rigid standards, like particular principles or moral rules, and they might be more open to experimenting with a variety of different ideas and trying them on and seeing how they, seeing if they fit, and so on and so forth. So different personalities are going to come up with different ideas and different ways of thinking about the world. Someone who's extroverted might be more social in orientation, so their ideas are going to be more social in nature. So because of all of these factors, that personality will manifest different ideas, and then these ideas in turn will shape the environment and the reality in different ways. So it's in that sense, I think, that personality and temperament in some fundamental sense shapes reality. And then in kind of this reciprocal sense, reality also goes on to shape us, depending on the nature of the environment. So the ideas we have as philosophers, which are dependent upon personality and temperament, are going to shape reality. And then that reality is going to come back and shape us. So there's kind of this, this reciprocal interaction between the two factors. And Bertrand Russell, I think, talks about this nicely in his introduction to the history of Western philosophy. But it's complex, and it involves lots of different factors: personality factors, biological factors, social factors, and it's kind of the interplay between all of these different factors that gives birth to philosophy, and which in turn shapes philosophy as well. So that's kind of looking at all the multiple factors involved here. The pre-Socratic philosophers had their own, unique personalities and temperaments, and then these went on to shape the world, and then the world in which they live went on to shape the ideas. So there's this reciprocal interaction, and so I think it's a complex situation. This situation of why it is that we should value philosophy. I think in some sense it's trying to figure out the interaction between all these factors throughout history, how personality, how biology, how society all kind of interacted with each other. It gave birth to philosophy, and how philosophy then and then how the world shaped philosophy. So this dynamic interplay. And so yeah, so what are your thoughts on that the different factors involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, it sort of comes down to your biology, your physiology, sort of where I think it kind of all starts, and in particular, how that relates to your environment. So if you're, someone who is relatively weak physically, I mean, we can just look at Nietzsche's assessment in the genealogy of morals. His notion of slave morality. There's an adaptive reason, physiologically, biologically, even from almost like an evolutionary survival perspective, as to why certain groups of people develop certain philosophies and certain notions of morality. It serves their particular circumstances, their physiological needs. This idea of turn the other cheek. If you're an aristocrat, there's no way that if you're someone who's an aristocrat who has power, there's no way that that's going to be considered a moral action. Something moral. If somebody hits you, well, if you're an aristocrat, if you're a king, if you're a prince, well, you hit them back. But if you're a slave, certainly you're going to turn the other cheek, because to fight back certainly means the destruction of you and perhaps your family. And then, in terms of personality traits, I think personality is, again, sort of an interaction between these biological and physiological needs and the environment. If you have certain dispositions biologically, then if you have certain dispositions biologically, and you're in a certain environment, it's going to shape your personality. It's going to shape the way that you interact with the world. It's going to decide whether you're someone who's neurotic, someone who's open or extroverted. It really sort of depends on what situations you find yourself in.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that makes entire sense to me. I mean, it's a complex situation. The extent to which, we shape our reality depends on a host of factors, and the way that we develop as organisms also depends upon the reality in which we inhabit. So yeah, I think you summed it up fairly succinctly there. So let's just take a pause for a cause, and then we'll come back and we'll wrap up the rest of it.
Yeah, sounds good. See you in a minute.
So Ryan, I think there's another value to that we can reap in studying philosophy from the historical perspective, and I think this is to develop a causal knowledge, in the sense that studying the history of philosophy increases our appreciation of both Western and Eastern, of both our Western and Eastern philosophical heritage. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think much of our thinking, whether we're conscious of it or not, is Aristotelian or Platonic or Shakespearean. These are historical figures, philosophers, and writers whose ideas have become so deeply internalized, over thousands of years, at least 3,000 if we're considering the history of Western philosophy, that they've become unconscious, right? And so, the way I see it, the historical study of philosophy, therefore, um, is one way of making the unconscious conscious. That's a way of becoming mindful of what our thoughts are, what our ideas are, where they came from, and to evaluate the extent to which they are theoretically or practically useful, which is to say whether they explain the way things are and whether they help to make things the way we want them to be. And therefore, I think that the study of the history of philosophy, whether Western or Eastern, or whether it's the history of maybe the universe at large, can be immensely useful because it increases our locus of control and our autonomy. It enables us to become autonomous creators, as Nietzsche puts it, or as the famous American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson put it, it allows us to become causationists, causal forces in the universe. We're not merely passive organisms, that that the external forces operate on, that we're just kind of passive victims and things happen to us and there's nothing we can do about it. No, it's in the study of philosophy that we become, active participants in reality, and that we're able to shape our realities and become co-creators in the evolution of the universe, in the same sense that the artist creates a landscape on a canvas. Well, the philosopher can create a reality on the canvas of the universe, if that makes sense. And so, I think in that sense, such a causal knowledge and understanding lends itself to the conquest of happiness, and put differently, lends itself to the creation of heaven on earth. So that's what I think the value of philosophy is. I'd be curious to hear what your take is on that in wrapping things up.
Yeah, I think being able to study this from a historical perspective, being able to understand where our ideas come from, this is what got me into philosophy. I started off in psychology. I added philosophy as another major to my degree, largely because I wanted to understand where these ideas in psychology were coming from. And it really did help me become more of an active participant in conversations about psychology and about theories of mind, about different theories of how it is that we rehabilitate people, how we engage in therapy. I think it's immensely valuable to be an active participant in these conversations, rather than just sort of going to school or engaging in some sort of academic discipline without being able to critically think about the principles that these disciplines rely upon, and not understanding where they come from and why they are in place. I think that being able to take these unconscious ideas and make them conscious makes us someone who isn't just a practicer of a discipline, but someone who's able to move these disciplines forward, someone who's able to move themselves forward in these fields, in these disciplines. It gives us maybe a bit more of an open mind. It allows us to engage with people, from the perspective of therapy. It allows us to engage with people who maybe our method isn't helping them. And if we're able to understand where our ideas come from, where our methods come from, and what their intended purpose is, we're able to reflect upon them and maybe adjust our approach to help these people, to help ourselves, and just to move ourselves forward, as individuals and as a society in terms of helping people towards becoming happier, healthier uh, uh, individuals, participants in society.
Right. I think you summed it up quite nicely there. I think the value of being a philosopher and to study the history of philosophy in some sense is to, strive to be an effective human being. I think that's in part what it means to be a human being, is to, if we're going to be a complete human being, I think we in some sense need to be a philosopher. I think we're all philosophers in some sense. I think we just differ in degree rather than kind in that sense. So that was all very fruitful discussion. I guess we should probably bring this to a closure and maybe offer some concluding remarks to wrap this up. So in tying all of this together and in summing all of this up, was Pythagoras right in his conversation with Leon? Is philosophy is it earnestly looking into the nature of things, as he put it, and to be studious of wisdom? Or are there limitations to that way of looking at philosophy?
I think there are limitations to it. I don't think we can look into the nature of things completely unbiased, independently. I think we can do our best, but I think, a philosopher keeps that in mind. A philosopher keeps in mind where they're coming from. They keep in mind that tradition, that historical tradition of ideas. And if you're going to be an effective philosopher, I think studying and appreciating where your ideas come from, that's the first step to being an effective philosopher. And maybe sort of shedding off some of those biases, or at least knowing that they're there and that we can't entirely get rid of them. I don't know if I agree with him, wholeheartedly, like I said, about looking at things, looking at the nature of things, sort of in this independent, sort of from a God's eye view, looking into the nature of things itself. But I think that's somewhat what the attempt of a philosopher is to try and do that as much as possible, and to acknowledge where it isn't possible to do that. I think those are both parts of what it means to be a philosopher. It's this intermediate of, it's sort of, again, that the intermediate between being completely objective, being able to look at things and have sort of this certain absolute knowledge, and being ignorant and biased, and just having to rely on certain principles that you've inherited in order to scaffold and come up with maybe not new ideas, but new ways of looking at things.
So maybe we can contemplate the ideal of the sage, Socrates, who admitted that the only thing he knew was that he knew nothing. So in that sense, we should adopt epistemic humility. We should recognize the limitations of our knowledge, of course, which is important. And even when we're looking into the nature of things, to always recognize that what we do find, what we do discover, is in some sense maybe just tentative at most, in that what we consider to be knowledge one day is going to be another day a falsehood. So I think that's very important.
Even if we've gone past maybe the primordial or primitive notion of personifying things in the way that the ancient Greeks did, I think there's still a certain way in which we work ourselves into philosophical investigations. There's a certain way in which when we think about these things philosophically, it is a reflection of ourselves. And Nietzsche talks about this. You know, every philosophy hitherto has been a you know, almost like an unconscious confession or a confession on the part of the philosopher, an unconscious autobiography in a certain way. I don't know if that's all that philosophy is, but I think it's impossible to escape it entirely.
Well, and not to drag our discussion on, too longer, but I guess this harks back to this point we were making of personality and how philosophy, in some sense, is an expression of personality of the person. And again, another, I think, fitting quote here is one from Emerson, which is that it doesn't just directly relate to philosophy, but he has a quote, something to the effect of, "There's no history, but only autobiography." So maybe this can be also extended to philosophy. There's not so much a philosophy with a capital P, that is maybe universally applicable, but maybe there's more of a particularistic kind of philosophy that is more representative of a particular person's way of seeing things, and maybe that's in some sense what philosophy is. It's a personal affair, and maybe that's inescapable. Although I would hope that there is some universality within philosophy, at least in some respects. And from my own perspective here, I think there is virtue to thinking of philosophy as some activity of looking. I mean, philosopher I think we both are sympathetic with is Wittgenstein, and I think he has a quote, something to the effect of, "Don't think, look." So, in some sense, be a looker rather than a thinker. Because of course there are certain things that are ineffable in our experience as human beings. And maybe it's the poets and the artists get closest to describing it, or portraying it. But there's an ineffability to our experience. Maybe we'll call it the experience of the divine or something like that, which makes itself manifest, in which we can use language to kind of point towards it, to show that it's there through saying. But in some sense, it's a fundamentally different reality than the verbal description of it or the written description of it. And so I think Pythagoras maybe might have had it right there, that philosophy is to look at things, to attend to things, to notice things and how they work, how they operate. I think what might be missing, of course, which we hit upon at the beginning of the salon, was that it might overlook the practical dimension of philosophy. It might overlook the attitude that the philosopher has towards wisdom, which is one of love in the erotic sense, maybe in the sense of philia, of loving wisdom like you'd love your grandfather, your wise old grandfather. So I think that sums up what I have to say in reflecting upon what Pythagoras had to say. And I think that reflects what I think of the value and scope of philosophy more generally. So we've gone on for quite a while now. Are there any last words you want to get in?
I think that's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with what we've covered, and I'm really excited for our next meeting.
Yeah, no, it should be good, and I think this was a good inaugural podcast. I think we covered things in quite a bit of depth. Probably one of the longest conversations I've probably had, philosophical conversations I've had, and I think it's been pretty fruitful with all its digressions and with all its imperfections. I think we've generated some interesting ideas and come to some interesting conclusions and clarified our ideas on certain subjects, and I look forward to the next one. So maybe on that note, we will adjourn for this first salon, and I suppose in the meantime, stay tuned for the next long discussion we'll have. I think we'll probably be covering the historical factors and the variety of factors that gave birth to ancient Greek philosophy. And we'll be diving into those in some depth. So stay posted for that. But in the meantime, keep philosophizing, keep thinking, keep contemplating, keep applying your theoretical and practical reason. And we will hopefully see you soon.
Till next time.